So there's something new that I have learned to talk about just this fall as a result of working with this group of beginners, particularly a series of conversations with one of them that's helping me find ways to try to explain how oral tradition feels in the Ashtanga practice, and why there's this really, really deep suspicion of book knowledge. And I wanted to share it with the rest of you in case it's useful. This is pretty deep in a way. There are a few layers, so stick with me. The way that for most of you, I've tried to introduce this idea of the fundamental limitations of text and the importance of like living knowledge in this tradition is by talking about the vinyasa. So there's a paradox there, because on the one hand, the vinyasa can be seen as like a text that is infallible. And in fact, there is actually a correct method that in really shallow ways can be written down on paper. And that's not debatable, right? The tradition isn't just ours to alter any way we want. It's so interesting. My teacher always says no one owns yoga, but that means no one owns yoga in the sense that it's not just ours to appropriate and screw around with either, right? And so the vinyasa is set, and it's a code, and it's correct or incorrect. And at the same time, the way that it's transmitted in the oral tradition is so alive, rather than like the dead knowledge on the banana leaf or paper, as it may be. And so I like to tell, as you know, about how I learned how to count the lead class. So I've taken hundreds, thousands of lead classes in my life, but in that context, when I'm receiving the instruction, I'm not in the cognitive mindset that would be necessary for me to keep track of, which one of these is Ekadasha, which is Dwadasha, whatever. And so when I made the transition to teaching, even after so much lead class, I really had no idea what the nature of the code itself was, what the written code was. And part of that is, just the way that my own state of consciousness was working in the lead setting. And so to remedy that, what I did was sit on the stairs of my teacher's shala and listen to him count the lead primary 1 or 2 times every Friday, and on Sunday as well. For years and years and years, listening to him count was, one, it taught me the literal count, but then all the stuff that you can't actually put down on paper was also received. This stuff about rhythm, syncopation, humor, the actual like DJ aspect of holding that count in a group on a day that's different from yesterday. And especially too, for me, the ways that the count as it's lived out accommodates human fallibility. So it's very rare to count a perfect lead class. It's pretty common to miss 1 or 2 vinyasas, even at the level that my teacher's at, was like he lives in the vinyasa count. And whereas I would never ever notice that in the context of being a student in the room, the way that he smooths over and stays with the rhythm when the natural sort of vrittis of like human existence come up are also sort of part of the method. So it's different from like actually radically changing the vinyasa count. It's that in the lived experience of the vinyasa, there's this way of working with the natural vritti and the natural mistake that come up when you're counting. So the thing that is so common in any mystical tradition, is this suspicion of the written text. Whatever tradition you're coming out of, all of you who have a long history with some expression of Hinduism know this. I've heard this from those of you who are practitioners of Judaism and Islam. Definitely in the Christian tradition that I'm coming from, the mystical side of that tradition is actually very suspicious of hardened knowledge around like the Council of Trent or the Council of Nicaea, right? There's a sense that the real essence of methodology is contained in that which cannot be written down. So that's what we know already around here. And then there's these two other layers that are coming through now. And that has to do with the way these attitudes also express as we relate with our own source texts, right? So you already know that the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, you can't actually learn the techniques in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and follow them because they're systematically seeded with errors by the writers of those texts, because they don't want you trying to learn those methods from a book absent someone who can keep a handle on your process and your nervous system and make sure you don't get energy sickness, right? So similar to that, there's this sense in the way that we relate with the Yoga Sutras that, coming down directly from our teacher's teacher's teacher, is so deeply contextualized that if you try to get the knowledge from the book of the Yoga Sutras, there's a really good chance that you're going to over-intellectualize and also just totally lose the plot of how we in this tradition relate to that text. The example we've used recently is okay, so if you take the text of the Yoga Sutras and you ask the question, what is the basic purpose of yoga? What's the point? If you treat the text as some message in a bottle, you're what did this one man mean when he wrote this down? Then you can get quite a laundry list of different possible definitions that all seem to be sort of comparable, and you could try each one of them out and almost see the text as maybe even internally contradictory if you're interpreting the sort of text on its own terms, as a hermetically sealed document. So if you think about it, if you're going through the different expressions of yoga in the sutras, you're trying to figure out what's the point. You might be yoga is the cessation of movements of the mind, or it's the restraint of the movements of the mind. That's the point. Or you might think the point is to balance the sort of upward and downward, the solar and lunar energies within the system. You might think that the sutras are saying that the purpose of yoga is samadhi, or experiences of absorption or oneness. It might be saying that the purpose of yoga is to get a comfortable, stable posture, right? There's a laundry list that emerges if you take that question to the text in a kind of the manner of exegesis, right? Well and good from if you're an academic, but if you're actually practicing in our community of practice, then again, if you've been around a while, you know that there's a whole social context about the way that the sutras are alive to us, because there's this question of what did our teachers say was the point of yoga? So again, that Krishnamacharya taught the sutras 8 times to his son, Desikachara, and the product of that was a whole lot of different lenses on this text that are now alive and well being passed down if you come close enough to the stream of knowledge to really step into it and flow with these living interpretations that you have. And this is where you get something that I had never gotten from my from, reading the sutras without a teacher and without the possibility of conversation and application. And that's this really fundamental teaching that the purpose of this yoga, according to Patanjali, is viveka. So we're here practicing for discernment. So that takes us to a very, very different orientation of practice than if we were like, pick up the book, be like, oh, I'm gonna try to achieve samadhi in my practice, right? From the Krishnamacharya angle, like, no, samadhi might be a side effect of practice that can serve as a resource for your discernment, but that's not the end of the line. You're not just trying to snuff yourself out and stop. But you could definitely make a case if the text were all you were working with for that mode. So, part 3. What this led me to understand, especially working with people who come to yoga with social context in a variety of different religious or even professional settings where there's a relationship to a text, is this sense, this birth of this theory for me, that there's something like a spectrum in the way that communities of practice, or people who have a practice, relate to their source texts. There's a source text in almost every profession or practice or religious tradition. We were talking about the source texts for the practice of sociology. There's definitely source texts that have been around so long that they are like sacred texts. And a lot of the ways that sociologists will define themselves is in opposition to or relationship to some of these source texts. So as I'm starting to see it, it's like if we are gonna construct a spectrum from sort of the right to the left, so I'll say this is the right and this is the left, on the extreme right side of the spectrum, you would have relationships to text that would be literalist. So let's call literalism the extreme right. So people who are lawyers, among that community of practice, there are those who are like, all that matters about our founding document, the Constitution, is the founding fathers' original intent. So we're gonna read the Constitution to figure out that intent, regardless of the social context. We're gonna completely dismiss the social context and fashion ourselves as what is called strict constructionists, right? So that's the kind of message in a bottle approach, the idea that Patanjali had a message for us and we're just gonna only look at the text to figure out what that might mean in our interpretation. So the operative question isn't so much like, how do we relate this text to figure out how do I live our lives, which might be the question over here on the left side of the spectrum, but rather, well, what did they mean when they wrote things down at the time and place that they did? Certainly you can imagine the ways this comes through in religions. So my own background, where I knew a huge number of Christian fundamentalists who are still doing their thing every time I go back and hang out with them in Montana, the idea is very much, well, what is the literal word of God as revealed right here in this text, which is where you get decontextualized interpretations of, for example, the book of Leviticus and attempts to somehow apply that to modern life. Right, so this is over here, the sort of right side of the spectrum. On the extreme left, so I'm actually gonna be a little ungenerous here. On the extreme left, from this other pole of like the literalists, I would say there's like an almost enmeshment that can happen with the text, where like the immediate social context overwhelms the text itself to the point that the text any sense of having an original intent or meaning that isn't immediately obvious completely falls away because the text has been absorbed and enmeshed sort of into the current social context. So back to Christianity, there's a translation of the Bible called The Message, which is in vernacular English of a particular moment that does a little bit of this, where if you were reading the Message, which is written in some cases in almost like a slang language, in complete abstraction from the Greek and the Latin origin texts, so much is lost that really there's a self-referentiality of that kind of embedded relationship with the text. I've seen this in Buddhism a lot with a kind of rewriting of the story of the Buddha as if he didn't practice child abandonment and abandonment of his partner, right? So rewriting the story of the Buddha to update his actions to current social norms as if he could be once again like a model citizen is a way of actually stripping out the historical facts that we know about the Buddha to overwhelm and absorb and enmesh the relationships to the historical record, right? I see this also in Lit Crit. So I accidentally once ever went to an English class as an undergraduate, and it was my first and last, and they were discussing Huckleberry Finn from the point of view of radical extreme deconstructionism. So, I read that book when I was 11 and had a certain relationship to the text that definitely didn't account for the many, many forms of oppression and racism and misuse of power that the text legitimates and expresses. And at the same time, at that moment in the attitude of extreme deconstructionism, the text only existed for the English majors as a sort of lens into the psyche of the misuse of power at the time, right? So the story fell away, any sense of the document having any integrity or coherence at all was completely overwhelmed by the use of the text itself to reaffirm the morality of the moment, right? So at that time I was like, okay, that's great, but I'm going to get that knowledge from political science rather from these attempts to retroactively psychoanalyze authors. But that's again, that extreme left wing is not actually where I'm pointing when I say that we, in our sort of socially embedded approach to practice, are still very much leaning to the left, very much more towards a sort of socially contextualized than a decontextualized or literalist reading of the sutras. There's a sense that what we want to do is, as much as possible, just use the text as an excuse to orient towards the community of practice that has preceded us. So we know that our teachers and those sort of in the immediate previous generations have used this text for insight in their own ways. And so it's a window into their experiences and the way that they've passed the experience one to another, person by person. And the reason this comes up for us is that I have been given the instruction from my teacher that, Angela, the way that you should teach is tell your students about the history of this practice. Tell your students specifically about the generations of teachers in this practice. The word that my teacher used for this is parampara. So the sense of being in a lineage of practice is more than anything my charge to share with you. I wouldn't have chosen to do it otherwise, but because it's part of what I've been asked to transmit, that itself is putting me in this orientation to the method itself. That means it's not just a decontextualized, disembodied set of rules and rituals. It's something that comes from people and through relationship. So maybe that's useful. It's another level of depth, I hope. See you soon.